This is Ross Coulthard, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined on today's show by an Associate Professor of Teaching Philosophy at Ohio State University, Dr. Steven Brown. Steven, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
Really good to have you on. And straight off the bat, I'm going to be really honest and say I very much enjoyed your presentation you done at OSU. I believe it was at your university. Yep.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was not into anything UFO related at all until the David Grusch article in the debrief last summer, almost exactly a year ago.
Yeah.
I'm currently in Arizona about to give a talk on Buddhism at a high school philosophy camp at Arizona State University. I was here last year giving a talk on artificial intelligence. And right before I gave that talk, I saw on Reddit that this David Grusch article came out. I read the whole thing and it just completely blew my mind. And I kind of followed the fact check articles that the debrief did over the next several days. And that's what got me started. And I fell down the rabbit hole, and I've been thinking a lot, way too much ever since then, about what this means for us. I believe David Grusch. I think that everything he's saying is essentially true. I mean, when one of the things I like about Grusch is he makes it very clear when he's speculating and when he's speaking from his experience as an intelligence officer. When he's speculating, he's just like all of us, just speculating. But when he's speaking from his experience, I believe that everything he's saying is true, which is spectacular and shocking. and so I've been trying to think about what all that means for us and for me as a person who teaches philosophy. I've been, and also kind of particularly, and how we should be thinking about how we move forward as a human family, as a species. And anyways, so when the fall came about last fall, I introduced a short unit into my Introduction to Philosophy class on the epistemology of UFOs. There's a couple of nice articles in some philosophy journals. I picked out one that kind of compares David Hume's argument against miracles to some issues about believing in UFOs or testimony about UFOs. And then I also did a small unit on the epistemology of conspiracy theories. Epistemology, if you're not familiar with the term, is the study of knowledge, what it means to know, what it is to have a justified belief, a rational belief. That's epistemology. We'll talk about epistemology probably quite a bit today. So anyways, I was doing that class and I'd been watching for this. I knew that the Mexico hearing was coming up. I had it on my calendar. I was looking forward to when it hit. And then, of course, these two very strange objects, Clara and Mauricio, these two Nazca mummies, which is not quite the right term for them, but close enough, were brought out on stage and shocked the world, and everybody dismissed them. And I was really taken, especially by the argument that Dr. Zelza Benitez gave about the soft tissues, the connective tissues in the bodies. And it inspired me to go deeper with it. I spent a lot of time looking into it and thinking about it. And I was just noticing how media coverage was honestly just terrible, like completely dismissive and not paying any attention to the arguments that were being given by the Latin American scientists and academics and medical professionals who were talking about it. And so I decided to have a little event with some of the students from that class. Just, it wasn't even for extra credit. It was just like, hey, this thing happened and I'm going to give a little talk on it. Come if you want to. And there were maybe 50, 60 students there. So I just talked to them and recorded it for my own purposes and shared it with some friends, but didn't really make it public until earlier this spring. And then, it was funny because I didn't put it on Reddit. Somebody else put it on Reddit. And there's the subreddit r/alien bodies is the one that is kind of paying the most attention to the Nazca mummies. And I think my video is actually still pinned at the top of that subreddit. but that resulted in everybody who was paying attention to the Nazca mummies knew who I was. And so I started getting floods of emails and messages on Instagram and Facebook and all over the place. People who liked the video, thought that I did a decent job laying out why these things are interesting. And so at this point, I've talked to almost everybody who's working with and around the Nazca mummies, including some of the most prominent skeptics. So that's kind of how I fell into all of this. So that talk was kind of an event that I had at OSU just for fun for my students, and then it's kind of turned into this snowballing involvement in what's happening with Nazca.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered half my interview already. No, but I'm going to dive deeper into some of those because
great.
Yeah, it's efficient, and it's an interview for the 2024.
Sure, go. Yeah, we can finish early, and I'll just take a nap or whatever.
That's it. We cut it up into clips. But I say about 2024 social media age. I thought, and I've got down here that you speak to the audience you've got there in a pretty plain language. You're not telling them, this is true, so you have to believe me. It's a presentation of facts and your opinion, but also a lot of logic as to why you've come to that opinion or conclusion. I think if you take the Nazca stuff out, because it seems to be there's a long introductory point to the presentation, and then you go into the Nazca stuff in a lot of detail, which is great. Just taking that introductory point out where you discuss the kind of modern history of the topic, it's a wonderful introduction to folks, I think, who are new to the UFO topic to watch that and go, look, if you don't have 20 hours to watch DVDs, Christ, that's old, YouTube, Netflix documentaries, read books, listen to audiobooks. Here's a pretty quick catch up to speed on what's happening in the last 5, 6, 7 years and why we are where we are. Then you get into the Nazca mummy stuff, which is really interesting in itself, and we're going to talk about all of that. But as someone, like you're saying, pretty new to the subject, did you have any interest in UFOs before the debrief article and David Grusch?
So I didn't have any interest in UFO stuff. I knew basically nothing. I've to this day not seen a single episode of the X-Files. So I actually used to use in philosophy classes. I would talk about situations where the evidence you need for believing someone shifts depends on what your background information is. And I literally used to use as my example, if someone told you that they saw a UFO descend out over the oval in the center of the big kind of quad area in the middle of Ohio State, and they said that it landed there and the aliens came out and talked to them, you could pretty safely ignore that, right? Like you just discount their testimony and wouldn't really have to worry about that. That was what I used to be up until David Grusch. Grusch was world changing for me. He definitely has the credentials. He definitely had access to just tremendous amounts of highly classified information in his roles that he played, both in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. And so, as I read the fact check articles that came out over the next few days, as they were just confirming, he really is who he says he is. And people are speaking for him as a person. And then he's being taken seriously by the Inspector General of the intelligence community. He's briefing Senate intelligence, and ultimately Senate intelligence goes on to produce the first version of the UAP Disclosure Act, which has, this the power to take back from the military industrial companies flying saucers and alien bodies, right? Like most people don't even know that any of this is happening. But it's just like this is just a true historical feature of what has been going on, in particular in the government of the United States. And fortunately, I haven't had anybody really push me on the legitimacy of my interest in this subject, because we're philosophers, we think about weird things all the time, and so people don't care all that much if I start thinking about the implications of aliens and flying saucers, right? But if someone did push me, I could just be like, look, all academics are allowed to think about this now, because the government of the United States, if only for this reason, the government of the United States, the Senate, passed, not just tried to pass, the Senate passed the first version of the UAP Disclosure Act. And then, of course, it got stripped down in the House. And so, okay, we need to start asking ourselves, what would it mean if the claims that David Grusch is making are true? And I kind of realized that as soon as David Grusch hit. So I went into kind of what some people call ontological shock, right? Like my worldview shifted, and I realized, oh, I know nothing about what's been going on. And so I just started frantically reading and watching YouTube videos and listening to podcasts and talking to anybody I could. Actually, for the most part, I did that alone. It was kind of me and ChatGPT in the middle of the night, talking about everything. Right? I'd find out about a book and I wouldn't have time to read the book. So I would just kind of go hit up ChatGPT and be like, all right, what's basically going on in this book? And, of course, there are some books like Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia that I've read in its entirety because it's not easy to summarize and it seems very important to me. So, it's not that I've never done a deep dive, but most of what I've been doing is kind of skimming along the top of all the stuff that people have been sharing and trying to understand what the long history of this has been going on. And, there's kind of these two ways of thinking about it is sort of from the 1940s forward here in the United States, especially. There's been a lot of secrecy and strange claims being made by people who claim to be whistleblowers who work inside these programs, or, declassified memos from the CIA or things like that, there's a lot to know. And then I wasn't paying any attention. So I came to it through Grusch. I started paying attention to the kind of US based stuff, especially. And then I knew from the beginning, look, if they're here and they've been here since the 40s, probably they've been here longer than that. And, we have these strange accounts of the airships in the 1800s and the, Jacques Vallée talks a lot about parallels with things like fairy lore. And, we've got that medieval manuscript from Germany about an apparent battle in the sky. And, my background is in Christianity. And, there's strange wheels in the sky and beings coming from the sky and lights moving through the sky all over the place and there. And so, I'm still puzzling through how to make sense of all that stuff. But I was very open to the idea that there have been other beings engaging with us for a very long time. Who knows how long? And then the Nazca mummy stuff kind of hit. But to answer your question briefly, I'm not good at answering questions briefly. I didn't pay any attention to it at all until David Grusch. And so everything I know, I've learned literally in the last year and 4 days.
As a podcaster, it never bothers me if a guest answers a question long form. One, if it's rambling nonsense, I can make that sound like not rambling nonsense. I'm going to leave your rambling nonsense in because it was fine.
Good, I like it.
But otherwise, it's one-word answers, and that can make for a really short show. So, I appreciate the answer. It's a lot of information, which is good. And I wonder then, if you just got into it a year or so ago, and you say, you're quite right, many folks even now aren't seeing this information on mainstream media. Yeah. In the UK, if you ask 100 folks who's David Grusch, I think you'd be lucky to find 1 in 1,000 who could tell you who he is. I imagine in the States, even though it made the news in quite a big way for a while, David Grusch done Rogan. Again, it's that wave, that kind of roller coaster, the peak's gone and we're back at a kind of low level for now. Did you know who Dave Fravor was, Ryan Graves was, the Tic Tac incident? Did you know about that? Because that had been in the news for the couple of years previous, or is that stuff you're oblivious to?
So I wasn't entirely oblivious to it. I remember when the New York Times article hit, and it was enough to just kind of lightly pique my curiosity, right? Like, that's weird. I wonder what's going on there, that they seem like credible people. I've always been an aerospace geek. I wanted to be a fighter pilot for a while. And then, I wanted to be an astronaut. I went to space camp a couple of times, right? Like, so I've always been fairly aware of what's going on in the aerospace world. So when people started talking about the Tic Tac incident and the other, Go Fast and Gimbal, and some people were saying like, maybe it's just a classified project from Lockheed or someplace like that. And I was immediately dismissive of that. There's no way that that's what they are. because that would be such a quantum leap in our capacities, aerospace capacities. That no, if they're real and it's not some kind of a natural phenomenon, then it's aliens. Like I came to that conclusion in 2017. And but I just was like, I don't know, we're not going to figure this out. I guess they're going to set up this new organization and look into it, and we'll hear more about it later. I think I kind of assumed that it was probably some kind of a natural phenomenon, like, you know, most of the universe we think is made up of dark matter, which is just a fancy way of saying we don't know what it's made up of, right? And we're always discovering new things, and so who knows? Maybe it's some kind of small black hole passing through a bent time space, and, you know, a pilot saw it, and, you know, we'll discover what it is eventually. That's kind of where I was at
that still
point.
sounds pretty incredible, though. Like, you know, it's just a small black hole passing through a part of space and time that's been bent, you know.
But I mean, that's just astrophysics, right? Like the universe is very strange, and we keep discovering strange things. Now I didn't look into the details, remember, right? So I wasn't familiar with the degree of testimony that people have about the kinds of objects that they've seen, about, you know, that make it actually sound like people are seeing a craft, like a metallic object with lights or seams or whatever, windows, right? Like I wasn't aware enough of how many people had been saying they were saying those kinds of things. So 2017, Steven Brown was basically like, I don't know, maybe it's aliens. It's probably some kind of strange astronomical phenomenon that we don't understand, and we'll get to it eventually. But I knew then there was no, well, personally, I still, you know, I know people debate these things, so I guess I don't want to come across as too pompous, but I never took seriously the idea that it was like a classified US government project or like a Lockheed project. Like, no way. There's no way that we have anti-gravity technology unless we reverse engineer it. We didn't get it through the ordinary, you know, like physicists come up with theories and then we build things based on engineering. We didn't do it that way. If we have anti-gravity, we got it from aliens.
Yeah, it's not like discovering penicillin by accident. You know, someone was mixing petrol and diesel one day and went, "Oh, anti-gravity. This is new." So, yeah,
I mean, or maybe it would, but if that did happen, it would revolutionize everything. So either we don't have it at all. Either prosaic humans don't have anti-gravity tech, or it's so deep underground that it's not trickling into the economy and producing other technology, right? So it would have to be, like David Grusch is saying, this like super compartmentalized, siloed kind of access, because we've not seen any other use of anti-grav, and there would be just tons of other uses of anti-grav. So again, like if that had been invented in a lab at Ohio State, then, you know, we wouldn't be, you know, we would be asteroid mining by now, because there's just so much money out there in minerals and you know, everything. Like the wealthy and powerful people, if they had access to the knowledge that this stuff existed, they would be building technologies and building businesses and rebuilding the economy based on top of that. And they aren't. So either, you know, we don't have it, or if we have it, it's so deeply underground and siloed that that most people, it's not impacting the economy yet.
I think a lot of listeners and viewers will appreciate you've went on quite a hyper accelerated introduction to the UFO phenomenon to get pretty up to speed. I'm reasonably impressed. I'll say that much. And honestly, and the presentation. So the presentation, when I watched that, Stephen, was thinking critically and open-mindedly about the Nazca mummies. I watched that twice now. Again, most recently today on YouTube. And like I said earlier, that first kind of 20, 25, 30 minutes is a wonderful summary and introduction. Now, I'm going to take a guess at the age range of 50 to 60 people you say were in that room. Are between 17 and 20?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe a little older than that, maybe 21, 22, right? By the time they're getting to be seniors. Yeah.
Sure. And I could tell that would go down really well because you don't speak to them like they're stupid. You don't bore them to death with a subject. You're really honest and you'll say things like, well, that should be crazy, shouldn't it? Or this is going to sound weird, but... And then, like you say, you hit them with logic, you hit them with facts. And I love the way you present the opposite way of, Carl Sagan and maybe some of the more debunking quotes around the subject of, here's the obvious facts that we know. And then I believe, the conclusion, for example, is, however, I've not observed any aliens, so there aren't any.
Yeah.
However, actually, based on the logic, there are aliens, and here is the evidence, and that's where you go into the Nazca mummy stuff. Really interesting. Like you say, you've covered Grusch, you've covered all of that. I'm going to get into a tale of two hearings. So you start comparing, from my point of view, the US hearing in July with Grusch, Fravor, and Graves, and the Mexico hearing, which happened where the bodies were presented of the mummies. And I'm going to say mummies in quotes because you quite
That's fine. Everybody calls them that.
They are,
so they're the mummies.
but that's relevant. Okay, so they're not being mummies. Does that term mummies, given that it's factually incorrect, is that detrimental to what's being presented?
I don't think it's that detrimental, because I think the term mummy, like in its technical use, involves organs being removed from the body for the purpose of preserving them. And these are not, apparently, don't seem to be that. Although I've heard mixed reviews on this. Apparently there is some evidence that at least with some of them, organs might have been removed. But for the most part, they look like they're just dried out. So technically they're desiccated corpses and not mummies. But most people don't use the word mummy that way anyway, so it doesn't really matter that much, I don't think.
Cool.
So go. I don't know. Well, before I blather again, like
from the beginning on that. From the beginning on that. Then, so you've got these two hearings. One, I think you've been pretty clear in why you're listening to Graves, Fravor, Grusch. You're hearing what you're hearing. It's a wow moment. You're seeing the debrief articles. People like yourself are picking this up and going, here's a story I need to pay attention to. There's something to this. You then see the mummies being presented. What about that resonated with you, that it's something you picked up and ran with?
So it's several things. So the reason I did that first whole section is because I think you will approach things like the Nazca mummies very differently if you've already made the paradigm shift from there's probably not aliens to there probably are aliens, right? This is so I think I mentioned earlier that my kind of historical area of interest in philosophy has been primarily philosophy of religion. And there's an argument from a guy named Richard Swinburne. He's an Oxford Christian philosopher, about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And he's, considering these arguments against miracles that philosophers like David Hume have been using for a long time. And Swinburne makes this argument that whether or not you think that Jesus rose from the dead, for instance, will depend on your background beliefs about like whether or not you believe in God and whether or not you believe that Jesus is the kind of person that if God existed, God might resurrect him from the dead, right? And so you've got that kind of background worldview, and then you evaluate evidence in light of that background worldview. So the punchline of this for me is, if you ask a question like, did Jesus literally raise from the dead? You're going to approach that really differently if you're a person who already believes in God versus a person who doesn't. And what that means is you may or may not be able to use the resurrection of Jesus as evidence for God's existence, right? You might have to believe in God in order for it to be rational to believe in the resurrection. Does that make sense? And I'm inclined to think that something similar is going on here with the Nazca mummies. Like, I'm not sure, certainly what's known to the public right now, I'm not sure if people who don't already believe in aliens should believe in aliens because of the Nazca mummies. That might not be right. But if you do already believe in aliens, then I think it's quite plausible that the most straightforward interpretation of the Nazca mummies is that they're aliens. I just want to quickly say on your podcast, like, I use the term alien very broadly. I know sometimes people use that term equivalent with extraterrestrial, and I don't. So I leave alien to just mean its kind of historical meaning of other, and we don't really know what they are. So So for me, when I was primed for the Nazca mummies in the sense that I had already gone through my David Grusch ontological shock. I already believe in aliens. I already suspect that they've been here for a long time. And then they hit the scene. And then, as I say, like, some of these Latin American scientists, medical people, researchers are presenting these arguments that strike me as very compelling. And so that's really what got me thinking about them.
Yeah, you state, and I think this is very fair. You're going to see folks, particularly, and hi to everyone in the YouTube comments, saying this guy's not a scientist. You very rightly put, and I recommend people go and watch your presentation because it's really interesting and it's fun. And I think fun can be missing really a lot in this subject at times. You're not a scientist, but I think
No.
you say you're a self-educated amateur. I think it's something along those lines.
Yeah, like I'm kind of an intermediate level science understander, but I'm not speaking as a scientist in that video, right?
Sure.
Like I'm
Yeah.
I'm just talking about kind of how to think about the testimony of people like Dr. Zelza Benitez, who's the forensic scientist who's in charge of forensics for the Mexican Navy, right? He was the one who convinced me that these things were worth paying attention to. But we're in this kind of weird situation as people who are non-experts in the sciences, right? Which is that there are scientists on both sides, right? And unfortunately, a lot of times, if you're speaking only to English speakers, you might get someone who says, "Hey, my day job is I'm an anthropologist, or I'm a paleontologist, or I'm a whatever. I look at CT scans all day long, and I looked at these things, and they're fake." And you can just kind of take my word for it. Like that's an appeal to authority, right? Like, hey, you don't know how to read CT scans. Hey, you don't know what goes into anthropology. Hey, you don't know what goes into paleontology or whatever. I do. So you can just take my word for it. Well, that would be fine, except that we have archaeologists and paleontologists and anthropologists and forensic scientists and hand surgeons and biologists who are in Latin America, who are working at universities, working in hospitals, working for the Navy, who have actually held these things and actually run them through scanners and actually studied those things more directly. And their testimony conflicts with the testimony of these kind of casual debunkers that we're seeing in the English-speaking world. And so there's this kind of background problem, which is the people in the English-speaking world who are like, hey, I have relevant expertise. These things are obviously fakes. Ignore them, are not taking seriously the credentials and the degree of work that's been done by the Latin American folk who've been looking at this thing, at these objects for now, whatever, 6 or 7 years they've been working on them. And so an appeal to authority isn't going to work here, right? And so the reason that I think it can be helpful to have a philosopher in the room is that I can kind of hear what's happening from these various competing experts and try to structure them together and see, like, how do these arguments fit together and how should we evaluate testimony in a situation like this? And how do we think about expert testimony when expert testimony is in conflict? And that is someplace where my expertise is actually relevant.
Yeah, on this Nazca mummies, I wasn't going to do any shows on it initially because I've spoken about it a few times on various kind of breakdowns and whatnot. And I personally didn't feel the way it was presented to me, I didn't have enough to follow up on. I didn't even know where to start sometimes on where to follow up on who is actually involved in this, why they're involved. One of the immediate red flags to me was Jaime Maussan being involved, because for me, he's someone who's been associated with a variety of hoaxes, kind of false flags and whatnot in the past. And there's a list of those, and whether that's deliberate, unfortunate, he's just the wrong place at the wrong time, or very naive, who knows? That's for other people to decide, okay?
Sure, yeah.
Jaime comes out and fronts this, so immediately I've got my backup, and so do some others. It's been very divisive. I don't think there's two sides of this fence. I think there's multiple fences with different cross sections here.
Yeah, good.
And people jump between them. So I jumped in, spoke to William Gallison on the subject. William is really, really interesting. Great reaction to that pod as well. I think he never convinced me otherwise, but he made me open my mind a little bit more to this. And a lot of folks said the same thing, which is, I think you're just trying to present the information. What I noticed when you presented the main folks involved in this, you had all of those you mentioned, plus Thierry Chamin, who is the French archaeologist and explorer, who initially had the mummies presented to him by essentially the grave robbers or tomb raiders, if you want to call them whatever. Is it Huaqueros? They're known as?
I don't speak Spanish well, so I won't say it better than you. But yes,
I'll keep you
I
that,
say
yeah.
Hulqueros, but I'm sure that's not right.
Yeah, I've probably butchered that and said something totally inappropriate, but that's
Yeah.
the gist of it. Yeah, the Tomb Raiders, grave robbers, presented this to Thierry, and that's what I talked a lot about with William.
Yeah.
I noticed in naming all of those folk, you never once mentioned Jaime Maussan, who
Yeah.
has become the front for this. Why is
Yeah.
that?
So for the reasons that you brought up, right, that people have been so dismissive of this because they see him associated for whatever reason, correctly or not, they take him to be a problematic source, and so they ignore the rest. And so I very specifically made the choice not to talk much about Jaime. I have a couple slides on Jaime in there. But one of the main things I wanted to say in that video is Jaime actually has very little to do with the relevant evidence. I mean, he wasn't involved in the case at all from the beginning, right? Thierry was the one to whom the person called Mario, that's not his actual name, but like the person we all call Mario. When Mario brought some of the bodies or the parts of the bodies, I can't remember, Will knows more about the details than I do there, to Thierry. Thierry took them seriously, and he went to the Ministry of Culture and tried to get them to take it seriously, and they didn't take him seriously. And that created this massive series of problems that continue to face the problems of the Nazca mummies, because they were not taken seriously. So ideally what would have happened is the Ministry of Culture in Peru would have said, okay, this is really weird and interesting. Let's get involved and let's find out where this site is, and let's protect it, and let's get some archaeologists and paleontologists and whatever experts we can into the site and figure out what there is and figure out what there isn't. And that didn't happen. And so what has happened is, Thierry has kind of been involved in it since the beginning. He's tried over and over and over again to get people involved with relevant expertise, to look at the scans, to look at the DNA, to look at the carbon-14, to look at the bodies, right? He's very open about this. I've talked to Thierry several times now. He's invited me down there many times. I haven't been to Peru yet. I'd like to go to Peru, just have to figure out the airfare. Anyways, so a lot of the story already happened before Jaime got involved at all. And then Jaime, was involved in producing this Gaia documentary. And again, people are dismissing it because Gaia was involved. And so I'm trying to steer clear of that. Now I want to be clear about where I personally stand with Jaime. I have not yet spoken to Jaime. I understand why people are critical and concerned about Jaime, but I think worst case scenario, Jaime is excitable and exaggerates and jumps to conclusions prematurely. I do not believe that he is a hoaxer. I do not believe that he's deceiving people. I certainly don't believe that he is somehow responsible for the production of the mummies' bodies, right? Like, he wasn't involved at the right time. So one of the things that people suggest is that because Jaime's involved, there's actually quite a lot of money in the air, and maybe he could hire somebody to produce these things. And that's just not understanding the timeline of what actually happened, right? So no, wherever these things came from, they came through Mario, and Mario and a small group of these Tomb Raider, we'll call them Tomb Raiders for now. These Tomb Raiders, they are the ones who are the source. Thierry didn't make them. I don't think Jaime didn't make them. Right. Obviously the Zalza Benitez and Rios Lopez and all the faculty at the University of Ica, they didn't make them. So if they were made in modern times, then they were made by the Tomb Raiders or people that they hired. But these are people who live in Palpa, Peru, which is a little tiny town. They're not sitting on boatloads of money. They're not sitting on state-of-the-art medical engineering labs or special effects labs or anything like that. And at this point, if you think that it's a hoax, then you have to explain how Mario and friends managed to produce now dozens and dozens of these bodies of different types that can be run through medical scanners by medical professionals, scientific researchers who can hold them in their hands and do analyses on them and say, we don't think these things are fake. We don't know what they are. They're very, very puzzling. And that's what the faculty at the University of Ica released this statement, right? Like, we don't know what they are. We're not saying they're aliens, but we are saying they have not been glued together from animal bones and wrapped in paper, right? Which is one of the debunking claims that's been floating around since, I think it was Estrada Moreno made that claim, right? And they're saying, no, they're not that, right? And so, like, if it's a hoax, it's an incredible hoax, and it's being pulled off with very limited resources in Pulpa, Peru. And you know, that's the part of it that that together with some of the details of what the bodies are, and at this point I know more than most people do about what the bodies are, that's the part that gets me, that makes me keep talking about this, right? Like people, they find something, even very, very, very smart people, they'll find something about the Nazca mummies that's too weird to be true. And then they will just jump to the hoax conclusion. And I want to say, look, there's there's actually three possible explanations here. Three possible explanations of what they are. They were either once upon a time some kind of a living thing, which is what they appear to be at surface level. They appear to be dried out bodies, right? So they either are dried out bodies of some kind of living thing, or they're manufactured, crafted, they're dolls or something of that sort. And if they're dolls, they were either made recently or a long time ago, right? So they're either actual bodies, or they are modern hoaxes, or they are ancient archaeological objects, right? Like ceremonial dolls or something like that, right? Like, those are the things that they are. And everybody just keeps latching on to the modern hoax hypothesis. And there are tons of problems with the modern hoax hypothesis. It doesn't explain all of the data straightforwardly. And so, I think it's one of the other two. Personally, I still think they are actually the dried bodies of some kind of a living thing. But even if they're not, I think the second most interesting, the second most likely hypothesis is that they were made 1,000 years ago as ritual dolls or something like that. In which case, even if that's true, then they're one of the biggest and most fascinating archaeological discoveries of all time, right? So everyone's latching onto this one explanation. The Huaqueros must have built these things just to make money. Honestly, even if that's true, it's fascinating, because at this point, I want to know how they're doing it, right? Like, I have CT scan data from 5 of the bodies that look like Josefina, 3 of the bodies that look like Suye. Those are the little ones that have the little wing-shaped things on their back. And I forget how many I have of the ones that are kind of full-sized, human-sized. I have at least 4 or 5 CT scans of those, right? I can say, like, if Mario knows how to build these things in a way that I can sit down with medical professionals and show them the CT scans, or veterinary professionals, or I don't know, is veterinarian a form of medicine? Whatever. I've sat down with a veterinarian, a gynecological oncologist, a couple of other people, a radiologist, a reconstructive surgeon. I've sat down with a number of people, an anthropologist, and said, look, here's what's interesting about these things. And I'll show them the 3D reconstructions that you can make out of these CT scans. And I'll say, look at this, and look at this, and look at this. And they'll go, yeah, that looks like the inside of a living being that's dried out. Now, then they're going to go, but that thing looks weird, and that thing looks weird, and that thing looks weird, and I think it might be a hoax, right? And I don't want to overstate where we are as a community of intellectuals who are trying to take this seriously. Most people are still convinced, even when they look at the data, they're still convinced that it's a hoax. It's just in my experience, that's people keep going to the hoax hypothesis. But I'm stubborn here, right? I'm like, but look at this, right? But like these features, for me in particular, it's features internal to the chest cavity of the bodies that, like the ones that were presented in the Mexico hearing. I call them J types, which just means like Josefina. Josefina was the first one that was given serious analysis. I look with my non-expert eyes at the CT scan reconstructions of what's happening inside of those chest cavities. And I have 5 of them. And I can say, well, look at this structure that runs behind the central bony column that runs through the middle of their body. Unlike our spinal cords, which run along the back, they run through the middle. They pivot forward toward the front, and then they go up. There's a strange kind of open honeycomb-shaped structure behind that forward pivot. And that's consistent across all 5 specimens that I have access to. And I will show the scans of that to serious medical people with scientific credentials and say, doesn't that look like a living thing that's all connected up inside? And they'll go, yeah, it really does, right? So we as a community of intellectual scientist types, curious people with credentials are not convinced what they are yet. I am personally still convinced that the best explanation is that they were once alive.
You've answered a few of my questions in there, and you've answered them well. Again, those kind of what for you stands out. Again, appreciate you're not an expert, but you know enough, and you're with other experts. You're discussing it properly. You're remaining open-minded and try not to be too biased in what you're seeing. But for you, it's quite conclusive. But I wonder, what then, in your opinion, is holding this back from being the major scientific breakthrough or discovery that it appears to be? I'm still skeptical. Yeah. I'm a huge proponent of the UFO topic. I want everything to be real. I want every single video, picture, body, piece of evidence to be genuine, alien, non-human, whatever it might be. But they're usually not. But sure. I keep going. I want these so badly to be genuine. Why are people like me and others still holding back? What do you think is missing?
So there's a lot that goes into answering that question. One is still that there's still a really massive stigma in place, right? Especially in academia, the world that I hang out in. So I know there are a lot of people who are involved at looking at these bodies and looking at the DNA and looking at the scans and the skin and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of serious people involved, and quite a few of them currently want to remain anonymous because of the stigma, right? Like if you are if you don't have tenure, right, then it's dangerous for you to be perceived as someone who is involved in taking seriously these views that are seen as the fringe, right? There's this concept, I think it's called the Overton window, right? Which is kind of the range of views that you can take seriously without being ridiculed in public, right? And it's outside of that. Isn't that what it's called? Overton. Sorry, I'm Googling this just to make sure.
No, that's all right. And I'll be honest, I understand that. I understand why anyone, not just this, but any aspect of the UFO topic, if you want to talk about the stuff Dr. Gary Nolan's been looking at, or a Kevin Knuth looks at, or a Jacques Vallée, I understand why any of their very, very serious colleagues may privately look at it and go, Jesus, that's quite remarkable. But do not let anyone know I've looked at this, and I'm not sharing my opinion publicly. I can understand that.
And I mean, look, good. I'm glad you do. And I hope other people do too. Like, if you look at what happened at University of Ica, right? I think there were 11 or 12 faculty members who signed that basically said, we looked at these things and we don't think they're fake and we don't know what they are. If you watch what happened in the kind of UFO sphere, the skeptic debunker world, when that happened, is everybody attacked their credentials immediately, right? Like, oh, what is this little tiny university in Ica? Who are these people? They're not really accredited, right? And there was just this like really deep rejection of the expertise of these people, essentially because they work at a not particularly well-funded university in Peru, right? And this is one of the reasons why I do get uppity about this, right? Like, I'm mad at how willingly people will dismiss the testimony of serious scientists and serious anthropologists and serious, right, everybody that's involved in this, just because they're in Latin America, right? And they don't work in a highly funded, really well-known research lab in the United States, right? And one of the reasons why, I am not saying this about you, but one of the reasons why I'm talking to you today is because it is starting to get more momentum, largely because there are some Americans who are starting to pay attention, right? And so, yeah, anyways, that's part of it. Like, one of the reasons is because not a lot of well-known scientists from places that people recognize are paying attention because of the stigma. That's one part of the answer to your question. Another part of the answer to your question is that the case is just incredibly baffling for many reasons, right? There are at least 4 distinct types of bodies, at least. The ones that look like Josefina, those are like the ones that were in the Mexico hearing. The ones that look like Suye, the ones that look kind of like Maria, those are the full-time, kind of the full-size human body ones. And then there are these hands that are like this big with very lots and lots of bones inside of them, lots of knuckles in them. Those are all very different from each other. They all have different features. They all have, like, they've been analyzed by different people. There's been some confusion about, we have some DNA. There's 3 sources of DNA that have been published. And it's like with one of them, the one called Ancient 0003, there's been debate about which being that's the DNA of, right? So essentially, because, I put essentially all of the blame here on the Ministry of Culture in Peru, because they didn't take it seriously. What's happened is there's been this fragmented approach by people who take it seriously for a little while and then maybe don't. And there's not been a sustained, kind of well-supervised research project. Thierry Jamin is the person who's kind of the closest to doing that, and he's doing his best to try to get people information and get the news out there and try to help people understand. But it's been kind of a disaster because it's had to kind of happen underground, right? And or at least on the fringes. So that's a reason. But the third reason, and I don't want to deny this, is that the things are really damn weird. And they are anatomically very strange. They don't have, their joints are weird, very different from ours. Lots of people look at them and say, well, they wouldn't have been able to move, or they would only been able to move in certain ways and not in other ways. So they couldn't have evolved. Like, those kinds of arguments are made. There is something to those arguments. They're very peculiar. If they were functional bodies that could move kind of like us, then they work differently than us in various ways. There are these very strange similarities between features in the skull and features in the brain cavities of llama skulls, camelid skulls. And so a lot of people have latched on to this debunk that the skulls of the ones that look like Josefina, they were constructed out of llama skulls. And that's not a totally implausible argument. If you look at the skulls, like, there really are very strangely similar features there. If it were just the skulls, I would personally be convinced, yeah, they're llama skulls. Somebody carved them up and covered them with fake skin, and then that's what happened. But for me, and for Zalza Benitez, which is the argument that I took seriously at the beginning in the first Mexico hearing, it's the soft tissues that matter. It's the way that they're connected. It's not the bones, it's the way that the bones are connected. And for me personally, now that I've had a chance to spend time with CT scans with some relevant researchers and professionals sitting by my side, pointing at things like, isn't that weird? It's the chest cavity. The chest cavity of the ones that look like Josefina. It's strikingly like an alien organism. It's not like a terrestrial organism. Some people talk about how maybe this is like a branch primate or a branch off of the dinosaurs, or I really don't think that hypothesis is going to work out. It does not look like an earthly vertebrate.
There's a few follow-ups, but I'll leave those for the listener questions, because a few of those go back into it, and I'll just be retreading the ground. I think there's an element as well, and I think you've addressed a lot of the skeptics or debunkers. And to be fair, a lot of those skeptics, and I have to throw myself into that hat as well, as much as I'm in the open-minded camp now with all of this, given some of the stuff I'm hearing. There's an element, I suppose, of many folks enjoy various different aspects of the UFO phenomenon. And if you're looking at things from a political progress point of view, folks see things are happening in the US, doors are being knocked on, maybe some barriers are being broken down very slowly. Are we moving towards something? Maybe, maybe not. And it almost seems like, if I use the analogy of a team of safe crackers all working on a safe for months and months and months, and they're working on different codes, and they can hear little clicks now and again, and that's the US political progress.
Yeah.
What this seems to have done is someone's walked up and just knocked on the door and it's opened. And everyone working on the safes went, oh, we've been doing a lot of work and really good work, and they've just rocked up and opened it. That looks really suspicious. And that's almost what this does, because it totally blindsides disclosure to say, well, there you go, there's the alien bodies. Next.
Yeah.
Not to say it's as easy as that, but it's almost like that. And I could see why some folks are a little, it's almost too easy.
Yeah. I love, this is a fantastic and very insightful question. Yeah. So look, I think that the Americans believe that disclosure is going to come from America. Big D disclosure, like whatever it is that kind of finally tips the paradigm and makes people change their minds about the phenomenon, will come from the government of the United States, finally telling us what they know. We know for a fact that they know more than they're saying. We know that there are photographs. We know that there are videos. We know that there are radar data. Like, that's not in dispute. Like David Grusch said in his testimony, I worked at National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. It was my job to look at satellite photographs of UAP. Like, that's what he said very quickly in the hearing, right? Of course we do. Of course we have satellite photos, videos, radar data. We know because of the Nimitz incident. There's radar data. It's never been released to the public, right? Of course they have it. They know what these things are. That's why they sent Fravor out to intercept. Like, we have radar data. So the data does exist. We know it exists, and we know it's not being released to the public. Of course, we don't know what it is, right? And we don't know what it means. And so there has been, like you say, this like lock picking effort to get at the information that the government of the U.S. does have and is hiding. Everyone seems to think that's where the paradigm shift will come from, and I don't think so anymore. I think it's going to come from outside the United States, and it does seem to be that the history of the past roughly a century has been dominated by the United States. It does seem that post-World War II, when this wave of UFOs goes across the United States, and people start talking about crashes and crash recoveries and bodies and all that kind of stuff, it does seem like the United States has taken their position in the global social political order to control what's happening there. You can imagine why this would happen, right? So let's just, I don't try to commit to any specific UFO recovery thing, because who knows what's real and what's not at this point. But let's just take the Roswell incident. Let's just say that it happened, just for the purposes of the argument, right? So there was at least one craft that crashed outside of Roswell, and there was at least one body inside of it, and some of that got gathered up. And then the Air Force lied about it, and then they sent it off to Wright-Patterson and wherever else. And who knows what's happened to it since then, right? Area 51 and such, right? Let's say that happened, right? And then let's say that key individuals in the government of the United States find out about this. When is this? This is right after World War II. This is right at the beginning of the Cold War, right? They're terrified of the Soviets. They're terrified of impending nuclear war, because they know the Soviets are starting to build their own nuclear weapons, right? No one's particularly worried about China yet, but of course that will happen later on, right? And then let's say they recover a flying saucer and alien bodies, right? Now, what are they going to be afraid of? Like they're going to be afraid to tell the American people, hey, it turns out that aliens are real. And they can fly in and out of our Air Force bases whenever they want. They can go to our nuclear weapons facilities. They can disable our weapons. And we can't stop them from doing this. That would be something they simply could not admit publicly, because the global order would fall apart. Right? There's a colleague of mine, Alexander Wendt, is a faculty in political science at Ohio State. He's written at least one paper on the problem of political sovereignty, right? In order to be in charge of a nation, you have to control the space. And if other parties can fly in and out of your most secure facilities and you can't stop them, then you don't have sovereignty. You don't have a nation. You don't have political control over your own airspace, land space. You can't protect your people. And if you admit that out loud, then you lose all confidence. Your people lose all confidence in your ability to rule. And then you don't have ability to rule. And then your society collapses. And then you have bad stuff. So let's say that someone briefed the president on that fact. What would the president do? The president would hide it. The president will do exactly what David Grusch says he did, which is to create Manhattan Project level secrecy and bury it and silo it. And maybe they could do something to try to figure out what's going on, but they would just bury the shit out of it. And do we think this happened? Yeah, we think this happened. We have documents that prove not that it was buried, but that prove that at least since the 50s and 60s, there are at least dozens of official declassified documents from the CIA in particular that just prove that the government of the United States has taken flying saucers, UFOs, very seriously since at least the 1950s. Yes, they exist. They're not ours. They're not our adversaries. We don't know what they are, and we need to know what they are. Right? The first head of the CIA. I'm going to look up his name so I don't get it wrong. Hillenkoetter, Vice Admiral Hillenkoetter was the first head of the CIA. He published, or he was interviewed for an article in the New York Times, February 28th, 1960, in which he just says there is this memo that shows that the Air Force is taking flying saucers very seriously. There are certain protocols in place where they're to be taken as serious business directly related to national defense. And he found that document and he gave it to Congress. There was a New York Times article about it. The Inspector General also confirmed that happened in 1960. So yeah, look, it's been there the whole time. The U.S. government's been hiding it, and everyone seems to think that disclosure will come from here. And I would just love it. I would just love it if it came from Peru instead. If it came from this kind of sensationalistic Mexican journalist who grabs these bodies and smuggles them to Mexico. I don't think Jaime actually smuggled them. I think somebody else smuggled them to Mexico. I think Jaime has actually at this point said who owns them. I suspect, I haven't looked into this, right, that Mario smuggled them across the border to Mexico, sold them to somebody in Mexico, and then Jaime brought them to Congress. I think that's what happened, but don't quote me. I mean, you can quote me. I guess this is an interview, but that's my speculation, just to be clear, right? I would love it if that were the thing, like the first step in really understanding what's going on, if it came from Latin America and not from North America. There would be a real poetic beauty to the United States losing control of the narrative.
Stephen, have you got time to go through listener questions? Because we've been going a while.
Let's do whatever you want, man. We could talk forever. You're a really good interviewer for one thing, but also I can't stop talking about this. This is the craziest stuff of the universe. So yeah, let's talk.
No, we'll go back to, like you said, bury the shit. Let's bury the shit out the mummies for a few minutes, and we'll come back to the mummies. I do want to say well done to Sam at the OSU UFO Club, because you mentioned him in your presentation, and I can't believe
Sam is actually a she, but that's all you.
Oh yeah, Sam. Yeah, well done, Sam, because to be male, female, whatever, at university running a UFO club can't be an easy gig. If Sam happens to listen to this, or anyone knows Sam, I'll happily pay and send a podcast T-shirt for them, free of charge, just for running a UFO club at a uni. So well done.
I'll tell her all about it.
Yeah, awesome. Please do. So I want to touch on you working with the New Paradigm Institute. So
Yeah.
I've hosted Daniel Sheehan, lawyer to the UFO stars and fraternity. As many will know him, very accomplished lawyer in his own right outside of the UFO field, has been for many decades. But you're working with the New Paradigm Institute, Stephen, to help other academics network within and get involved. Is that right?
Yeah. So what happened was Danny started doing the podcast circuit and talking about especially the kind of momentum behind the UAP Disclosure Act, which then kind of stalled, but is now picking up again. There is a new version of the UAP Disclosure Act that's starting to go through the process again, trying to get it passed for this year's National Defense Authorization Act. So he started talking about this organization they were putting together, the New Paradigm Institute. And the reason I like Danny, I don't agree with Danny about everything. Danny and I, we're friendly. We talk every couple of weeks, and we don't always agree about things. He's been very dismissive about the Nazca mummies historically, and I've talked to him about them and say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be so dismissive. They're interesting. So I just don't equate. If Danny says it, that doesn't mean Steve believes it, and if Steve believes it, it doesn't mean Danny does, right? So we're different people with different approaches. But the reason I like Danny and the New Paradigm Institute is because Danny is the only public figure, in my view, who is talking enough about how impactful this is going to be for people to actually go through the paradigm shift required to move from not taking alien stuff seriously to taking it seriously. Danny talks a lot about disruption to the economy, disruption to the political order, disruption to people's psychology. Like I think it's not taken seriously enough how much the human self-identity is as the peak of evolution, right? Honestly, it's really fascinating to me that this is happening at about the same time as the AI revolution, right? Like, I also think that we're being faced with the reality that very soon, like in the next couple of years, there will definitely exist an intelligent being of some kind which is substantially smarter than a human in every way. We will accomplish advanced general intelligence, and then we'll just be able to scale it. And so there will be an advanced intelligence that is more intelligent than us very soon. There will be humanoid-shaped robots with advanced capacities to move through the world that will be able to do most of the tasks that human can do better than humans soon. And this is not alleged low skill work is not what we're talking about anymore. We're talking about ChatGPT has already passed the bar exam. ChatGPT has already passed medical exams, right? Like we're talking about lawyers, doctors, etc. Like those are the ones who are going to start losing their jobs because of AI. And so with AI and the aliens, like humans are going to have to face this crisis of identity that we're just not ready for. Like, what if we're not at the peak of evolution? What if we're something like cosmic adolescence, right? And one of the reasons I love Danny so much is because he really recognizes that, right? Like, how can we help humans understand their intrinsic dignity, even if we are nothing more than cosmic adolescents, right? So anyways, that's all. I talk too much, but that's the stuff that Danny kind of attracted me with. So I approached New Paradigm Institute as soon as he started saying, we're trying to recruit academics to think about what this looks like in a university context, syllabi, classes, resources, etc. I started emailing, like, I want to be involved in that. And I got to have some nice conversations with Jim Garrison, who's the one of the people in leadership at New Paradigm Institute. He works in DC. And then I've been able to talk to Danny a few times. And I started talking to them about well, in particular, the thing that got me kind of in the door was I was talking about the review board that was described in the first version of the UAP Disclosure Act, which had, I think it was a foreign policy kind of a person, a domestic policy kind of person, political wonks, an engineer, a sociologist, an economist, and I don't know, there was something else in there, a historian. Which, first of all, that all by itself is weird, right? Like, why are we getting a sociologist involved if all they're going to say is, "Oh yeah, Lockheed developed anti-grav in the 50s, and we've been hiding it from you," right? Like, that's a weird thing to do. But under the assumption, which I assume, that what is about to be disclosed somehow, either sneakily from Latin America, or kind of surprisingly from Latin America, or less surprisingly from Congress finally passing something. Although honestly, that would be more surprising, all things considered, for Congress to do anything. What would be? Sorry, I got off the too many rabbit trails there.
But I keep the politics out of it, because that's another one. The emails will fly in.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, fortunately, it looks like obfuscation and push for disclosure have been coming from both sides of the political aisle here in the United States, right? So this is not a partisan issue. This is bipartisan, both directions. But okay, anyways, so I was talking about this review board, right? And I was like, there is no way that review board, as described, is big enough, diverse enough to be able to handle the task of deciding how do we tell humanity that we have been in contact in one form or another with non-human intelligence for decades. Minimally, you would at least need a psychologist, right? Like a psychologist who understands, paradigm shifts, trauma analysis, right? Like everybody talks about ontological shock. Like, man, we better have a psychologist in the room then who knows how to deal with people who are going through these really traumatic kinds of worldview shifts, right? So I started talking about that, and I was like, look, I don't think we can trust the Congress of the United States to have a good plan here. Look at the history of climate change in the United States. But you don't have, not only in the United States, but I'm in the United States. Look at what we've done. It's very clear that scientists have been saying since at least the kind of 50s and 60s that we're dumping too much CO2 into the atmosphere. This is very likely to have problematic impacts. And it's just the evidence has been getting clearer and clearer and clearer. And what has the government of the United States done about this? Basically nothing. Why? I don't know. It's complicated. Politics in the United States is complicated, but Congress is essentially impotent. So can we trust them to put together a really thoughtful plan by appealing to all of the relevant experts in all of the relevant fields? No, we shouldn't. So what should we do instead? Let's just do it. Let's just do it ourselves, and let's just do it now. We don't need the information that is being hidden. We don't need radar data and videos and satellite imagery. We don't need any of that stuff to start asking the question, what would it mean for humans to come to grips with this possible fact that something like Roswell actually happened? Let's just say, what would it mean? Look, okay, let me say this very, very clearly. I think it is obviously the job of academics today to start thinking about the implications of what David Grusch has been saying. If David Grusch is correct, then the biggest worldview shift that has ever happened on this planet is about to happen at scale. And we need to start thinking about what that actually means. How is this going to impact the economy? How is it going to impact the political order? How is it going to impact psychology? How is it going to impact relationships? How is it going to impact religion? And who are the people who are best equipped to do that? Honestly, in my view, it's the academics. Why? Because academics are nerds, right? They've fallen in love with some particular field and they've decided to spend their life on it. Is academia a relatively well-paying job? Yes. Are people in academia because of the money? No. Every academic could be making much more money than they are if they would just do something that was more straightforwardly capitalistic. Why are they doing this in academia? Because they love it. Here's all these people who have been studying every field of inquiry that we've ever had, and we need them. We need them now. So we need academics to start thinking now, writing papers now, putting together think tanks now. I'm not saying we should do one of them. I think we should have many. I'm glad that the New Paradigm Institute exists. I'm glad that the Soul Foundation exists. I'm glad that Galileo Project exists. I think there need to be more and more serious academic attempts to bring together people who care about these things, who are thinking about the implications of them and coming up with a plan, because I guarantee the government of the United States doesn't have a plan that is well thought through enough to actually take us through disclosure into a stable situation.
Let's jump. That was really well put, so I appreciate that. I'll let you grab a drink of water. Let's then jump into the listener questions, okay? And these jump all over the place, which I think can be a good thing, a little bit chaotic here. So the first one brings up something you mentioned at least once in your presentation. So Shrawat asks, could you expand on your skepticism towards the time traveler hypothesis and what issues do you see with it? I remember in the presentation you mentioned
Yes.
Aliens could be extraterrestrials, shadow terrestrials,
Yeah.
time travelers, and you have a throwaway remark, don't you? That I'm not really going to get into that. Not for me, but yeah, that's for another time. So now
Good.
is the time. So what's your issue?
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so what I actually have problems with are what are called closed causal loops. So if you watch, most science fiction about time travel, there are closed causal loops, right? So there's basically two types of time. There's three types of time travel fiction. There's like Terminator 1 style time travel fiction, right? I mean, spoilers for Terminator 1, right?
It's been enough time, I think. Yeah, if you've not seen it, yeah.
It's been a while. If you don't want to know the plot of Terminator 1, jump away and skip like 30 seconds or a minute. Okay, so right, oh my gosh, what's his name? Whatever. The general of the humans against the robots in the future sends
John
back
Connor?
his. Yeah, thank you. John Connor sends Kyle Reese or something, right, back in time to save his mom. And then it turns out that Kyle Reese is John Connor's dad. So John Connor sent a guy who was his buddy to go back in time and become his dad, right? But that means he was always his dad, right? So there's this that like the past causes the past causes the present, and the present causes the past. That's a closed causal loop, right? And closed causal loops are really, really problematic, right? Because it's sort of like when we talk about in philosophy, we don't like circular arguments, right? Or we don't like infinite regresses. Circular arguments, especially, we don't like, right? Like you don't want to define a thing in terms of itself. Like that's not helpful. And if you say, why does this thing exist? And the answer is because it exists, which you have to do if you have a closed causal loop. Then you run into this kind of metaphysical problem where this thing doesn't have an explanation. It just exists, right? It's not explained by other things outside of it. It just happens to exist and causes itself. So I don't think that makes any sense. I don't think closed causal loops make any sense. So all of those kind of like there's only one timeline, but it's looped like that. I think those are not metaphysically plausible stories. Then you have like Back to the Future style stories, right? You go back to the past, and then you accidentally make your mom fall in love with you, which means she's not going to get together with your dad, which means you're not going to come into existence. Spoilers for Back to the Future. And then you're trying to play Johnny Be Good, and your hand starts to disappear, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay, but that's not going to work out either, right? Because you are the child of some couple, right? Some pairing of mother and father produced your body. And if you can't go back to that time and then disrupt it, because that moment where you arrived, you didn't exist, right? So if that happened, then there would have to be either a parallel world or a branching timeline, right? Like either there's always two worlds, one in which Marty's parents fall in love without Marty involved, and one in which Marty's parents fall in love with Marty involved, and Marty just jumped from one timeline to the other. That actually does make sense, right? It also makes sense that if he goes back in time and then branches the timeline, now there's a parallel world where Marty shows up, right? And in that place, his hand wouldn't vanish. He could just make out with his mom and like do whatever he wants. It's not actually his mom, right? Because his mom didn't meet him. It's technically what we would call his mom's counterpart, right? So there would be a parallel world, and that would be his mother's counterpart. So okay, so I'm fine with there being parallel worlds or branching timelines. Quantum mechanics has already shown us that philosophy of quantum mechanics has already shown us that parallel worlds and branching timelines are already on the table, right? This is the multi-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanical phenomena, right? And so maybe that's right. Maybe it is somehow possible to move from a timeline to a parallel timeline or a branching timeline that's like that. But that's not time travel. That's parallel world jumping, right? And so if someone says they're from our future, they can't be from our future, because that would be a closed causal loop, right? They could be from a parallel world that's like ours and coming back to a time and then we would be a branch off of their world, or we would be a parallel world to theirs. Parallel world travel is fine, but time travel is not. I don't know. That's my hot take.
But there could also be the idea that time travel, we understand it in the way it works in the movies, and it's been explained in so many different ways. There could just be a different way that it happens that we just can't even comprehend. And these future Uzzies have worked that out.
So this is just me being an obnoxious philosopher. Like, I don't think that's going to work out. Like, I think we can kind of map out the logical space, and either any option that produces a closed causal loop, right, where an event causes an event in its own past. In its own past light cone, technically, is what you have to talk about, right? Then it can cause these closed causal loops. You asked me what I think about this. I don't think closed causal loops make any sense. So, and I don't think there's any way to get around that using technology or anything else, right? Closed causal loops, boo. But could there be a timeline that's essentially parallel to ours, a counterpart timeline, a counterpart Earth with a counterpart history, and they get into a nuclear war and they generate these weird gray-looking alien things, and they're like, well, gosh, I wish someone had done something different in human history. So let's jump to a parallel world where that hasn't happened yet and try to help them along. Fine. And if you want to call that time travel, fine. I would not call it time travel. I would call it timeline jumping, but that's just me being an obnoxious philosopher trying to clarify my terms.
Very, very quickly off topic, but sticking with that theme, what's your favorite example of time travel in any movie franchise?
Ooh, that's hard because I think it's really interesting in thinking about fictions that we can entertain, fictions that don't actually make any sense. Like, I don't think Back to the Future conceptually makes any sense, but it's still a fun movie. We kind of can get into that space where we're like, I don't think closed causal loops make any sense, but oh no, if Marty doesn't get them to kiss, then his hand is going to disappear, right? Like, we can feel the pull of that narrative, even though it's inconsistent. But honestly, I think the time related movie that is the most consistent and well known is the Avengers one. What's the Avengers? It's not Endgame, it's the other one.
Endgame, they go back, yeah.
Endgame, is it Endgame? Yeah. So they're actually not going back to their own past. They're going to parallel worlds and borrowing the stones from the other worlds and bringing them to their world and then putting them back. That actually works out.
Because Loki then investigates that with the branching timelines and explains it quite well, actually.
Yeah. So I mean, I liked the Loki series. Actually, really liked the Loki series. I thought it ended really nicely and did some cool stuff with Loki's character. But so that kind of like jumping across timelines stuff, I'm cool with. But anytime you get these nasty closed causal loops, which are like almost all time travel fiction is like, oh no, you're going to create a temporal paradox. In my view, temporal paradoxes are nothing to worry about because if you can get back to a point in the timeline, it's not your timeline, and you can just do whatever the heck you want.
Sure. Good answer. Thanks.
Yay.
Question from Major Truth. For those in the audience with a less studied background in philosophy, do you have any anecdotes of early philosophers discussing what we are calling the others in our era?
Wow, that's a fascinating question.
The listeners ask better questions than I do, honestly.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why, democratic institutions are good, right? Getting people to voice their ideas and thoughts. Okay. Boy. Not straightforwardly if you think about the UFO phenomenon from the kind of modern lens. But if you go Jacques Vallée and you start thinking about how this relates to spiritual things and kind of mythical things, then yeah, lots, right? So, right, the Greek philosophers talked about the gods, and sometimes they talked about them in ways that were kind of dismissive, and other times they talked about them in ways that sound like they believe in them, but they have to be interpreted differently, right? You have philosophers like William James, one of my favorites, right? His book on the varieties of religious experience, or right, the will to believe kind of stuff. He talks about these unusual paranormal kinds of experiences that people have. He tries to take them pretty seriously. But I will say that in my frenetic year-long attempts to get caught up on everything UFO and alien related, I haven't looked into this question yet. It's a good question.
So speaking of good questions, Newman sends in a lot of good questions. Usually I get a good half page of context first and then a half page of a question, but they're usually worth it. So bear with
I'll
me.
settle in. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Nature is weird and can be nothing short of a David Cronenberg-style horror show. So to play devil's advocate, does Dr. Steven Brown exclude anything, the possibility that the Nazca mummies are specimens from a mal-developed lineage of lizards that were just given treatment and burial according to local beliefs of the native South Americans upon their finding and being recognized as looking human-like? If so, are there any signs of wear on the mummies indicating that at least these creatures were indeed living human-like for a prolonged period of time?
Fantastic question. Okay. So personally, given my understanding of evolutionary biology on this planet, I do not think there's a plausible hypothesis where they are descended from terrestrial bony creatures. Part of it has to do with the structure of the hips. Hips on all of the terrestrial organisms are descended from the bony fish. It's essentially like our legs are the back fins. The evolutionary product of the back fins, and they have a ball and socket joint. So all bony creatures on Earth have a ball and socket joint on their hips, and these I'm going to talk specifically about the ones that look like Josefina for now. Because the other ones are different, and we can talk about them in a second. So the ones that look like Josefina, like the ones that were presented in the Mexico hearing, they do not have ball and socket joint hips. They have circular ribs. They do not have sternum. That's not anything like us. The thing that really freaks me out is this central column that, as I say, kind of pivots forward in their chest and goes up into the center of their skull. That's not how any terrestrial vertebrate looks like. No. If they're real living things, I do not think it makes sense to suggest that they are from a bony, that they're descended from the bony fish. And so could they have evolved on Earth without having descended from the bony fish? Sure. There's plenty of space under the ocean. There's plenty of space underground. Like, could there be whole ecosystems that are separate from ours but originate entirely on this planet? Yes, that's all a possibility. But I also don't quite understand why people are so averse to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Like, we know that there are just unimaginably large numbers of stars, like literally unimaginably, right? Like if I say there's a difference between 1 million and 1 billion, that's the difference between me going and buh, right? But like the difference between 1 million seconds and 1 billion seconds is really big, and between 1 billion and 1 trillion, and like it's actually not. We don't have the mental framework to understand how many stars there are, right? And our best estimates at this point are that there's roughly 1 planet per star. And people talk a lot about how it's not possible to travel between the stars because faster than light travel is not possible. But we have mathematical solutions to the general relativity equations that imply that warp drives are at least theoretically possible. And kind of the more that scientists work on this, it looks like it takes less and less energy to do that than maybe we thought. 0-point energy is a thing. Could it be exploited into a technology where you could get all kinds of energy out of it to do some kind of weird time-space warping thing? Maybe, right? Like, we know that it's true that there are stars like a billion or so years ahead of ours. Like, it's quite possible that there was an evolutionary process just like ours that happened on another planet in our galaxy, and they came to human level intelligence, 2024 level intelligence and technology, that happened 1 million years ago. And if they've had 1 million years to try to work out the physics and build a warp drive and get here, like, I don't understand why people take this as such a kind of off the table hypothesis that we need to explain everything in terms of life on Earth. Why are we being so geocentric again? Like, I thought we got over geocentrism. It's like, so is it possible that that the Nazca mummies were once living beings from Earth? Yes. Do I think that's the most likely hypothesis? No. I think they're either extraterrestrial or they're fake. But even if they're fake, I don't think they're boring, because they're either historical artifacts, which would make them fascinating, or modern, like a fantastic modern hoax that we should really spend the time to get to the bottom of. I feel like that was only part of the question. Was that all of the question?
I mean, it's hard to tell with Newman's questions, to be honest. But,
there was something else in there.
Something to expand on what you said, though. I can't remember who I spoke to some time ago, but they made like an off-the-cuff comment. But it just made me think that the idea that, you know, we crawl out the water and evolve from fish to whatever, lizards and into apes and whatnot. If something, and the comment was, if something just happened to come out the water a few minutes before we did, they would have a huge evolutionary advantage. Could very well still be from this planet, but may not be human. And like you say, did they go off into the stars before us? Did they go underground? Did they naturally think, do you know what? This is a massive planet. And actually, given the conditions, it's more savvy to live underneath.
Yeah.
They, you know, and then you hear about Atlantis, and that's a whole other, you know, way to go off on a tangent. But if it's a story and just, you know, things get bastardized along the way, who's to say there wasn't something to that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I think this is all really fascinating. And I think it's fascinating kind of regardless of what things you might think are going on. So let's assume that these craft, I call them 6 observable craft, the 6 OCs, right?
Yeah.
Anti-grav, hyperacceleration, whatever they all are, right? Like I don't like defining them as unidentified. That's a terrible concept. Like you don't want to build into the concept that it is unidentified, right? Like you want to build in the features that it has, or at least seems to
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So if these 6 OCs exist, that we know they can travel through the air without producing shock waves, which means they're not interacting with the local matter in a normal way. We know that they can pass through the sea very, very quickly. That's what the Navy folk are telling us. There is some evidence that they might be able to pass through solid objects. If you're not interacting with local matter in the normal way, then you might be able to just pass right through stone. In which case, man, there is so much room underground. If you had a craft like that, you could just go down there and hollow out a hole. You can make it as big as you want. You could pressurize it whatever you want. Depending on the depth, you could make it whatever temperature you want. You could fill it with whatever atmospheric composition that you wanted. If you have the capacity to pass through solid matter, then boy, you could build just an enormous civilization under the surface of any solid rock body.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it would also protect you from radiation, which would be great, because not all planets have our magnetic field, the luxury of our magnetic field to protect them from solar radiation. So yeah, actually living underground is a great idea if you can do it.
Yeah, if you think of the planet, and we literally live on the skin of this huge orange, and there's a whole orange underneath that we don't even know what's inside of it. So
yeah, absolutely.
I'm not saying that the whole moon's made of cheese, we're made of orange, but you know, folks, that's, you know, definitely not as a Scotsman. We wouldn't use a fruit. So Major Truth, that was yours. Thank you very much. Newman, user K9Y. Has Dr. Brown found that there is a somewhat trickster element to all of this? Not necessarily malicious, but kind of childish, as in naughty. And I suppose if you've read or looked at any Jacques Vallée side of things, this is something obviously comes up rather regularly.
Yes. So the answer is yes. And I really don't know what to make of any of this, right? I do take the Jacques Vallée views seriously. He makes a very compelling argument that there are these parallels between fairy literature and the things that people are experiencing in the UFO space. And yeah, tricksters, right? Strange behavior that seems to be deceptive, right? Like for me, one of the compelling cases that I think of are these waves of airship appearances that happened in the United States in the late 1800s, where they allegedly encounter these beings who say they're from Mars and Venus, right? What's going on there? But in particular, yeah, look, this is a really fascinating question. With regard to the Nazca mummies, if it turns out that they are what I think they are, which is the remains of some kind of living being. There's this really weird question about why they look so much like llama, why their skulls look so much like llama skulls. And like, could I imagine some, I don't know, higher dimensional being like creating a body that looks like a llama skull so that it's especially hard to figure out for humans? Or like, I don't know. I don't want to go there because it's weird, but there's enough weird stuff happening. I don't know if you pay attention to the Nazca sphere, right? Like all the people thinking and talking about the weird stuff does keep happening. Like Jaime put together this whole event in Los Angeles and tried to do this live stream about the announcement.
Yeah, I tried to watch it. Yeah.
And it just completely fell apart. And it was a disaster from beginning to end. The live stream kept crashing. And then the translation kept like fading in and out. So that even Google Translate or the YouTube Auto Translate couldn't deal with it because the audio is mixed. So you could hear like part Spanish and part English, no matter which channel you went to. And it was just a weird disaster. And there was definitely a part of me that was like, is someone messing with this? And I don't think we take seriously enough the group of beings that I just like to call the neighbors, right? Like whoever these beings are that seem to exist, seem to be acting intelligently and interacting with us in various ways. They do seem to be tricksters. They do seem to mess with us for various reasons. And like, if you imagine these beings who maybe have the capacity to interact telepathically, could they mess with us in ways that are hard for us to understand, that look Jacques Vallée-ish, tricksterish? Yeah, they really could. And I know that people get itchy when they think about, I know when I just said the word telepathy, right? Like a whole bunch of people in the YouTube comments are going to be like, oh, come on. You believe in telepathy? So first of all, literally everybody should believe in telepathy, because telepathy is actually the name of a product made by Neuralink, owned by Elon Musk and friends, which puts wires in people's brains to allow a direct brain to computer interface. That exists, and it is called telepathy, right? Now, it's not at all hard to imagine a future version of that, honestly, within like a decade or so, where you do brain to tech interface, then you just send tech to tech and then back into the brain again. That like, it is a totally solvable technological problem to just be able to communicate mind to mind using existing technology plus 10, 20 years worth of refinement. So if that's possible, and then we go back to the fact that we know that there's been enough time for there to be a human level evolution plus at least 1 million years, it's really not crazy to think that there might be beings who have either technologically or genetically or spiritually generated the capacity to communicate directly mind to mind. It is not a crazy thing to think about. In fact, we need to think about it because it will be technologically possible soon. And I've been thinking a lot about kind of ethical and social and political implications of telepathy just because of the tech. And then if there's aliens, then you got to throw in the aliens too.
I'll say two things just for the record. One, my dog is enough for me to know there's telepathy, because how he knows, my wife phones me to say, if she doesn't know what time I'm coming home from work sometimes, she'll be like, are you on your way back? I'll be like, yeah, I'm a couple of minutes away. She'll be like, the dog has just ran to the back door and sitting waiting, and he always knows when I'm coming home. So that's that. And the other one, and just for the record, for the ones on YouTube that may kick off, that event in Los Angeles, I think sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy is just some of the folks involved in that is enough reason for it to go tits up, as we say in Scotland. So as much as as much as I'm all for the trickster stuff, and I've spoken to folks at Skinwalker Ranch, and tech can go weird sometimes, there's also sticking stuff outside in a gazebo in LA and expecting it to work, and maybe Gaia should have spent a few more money on that.
Yeah, fair enough. Like, there's certainly other explanations, but the reason I bring it up is because I really do think we need to start taking seriously the possibility that there are other agents involved in our history. in ways that we're not used to thinking about it, right? Like even those of us who believe in aliens and UFOs and stuff, like it's hard for us to actually make the shift to think, gosh, maybe some of these events that I experience on a daily basis are being influenced in one way or another by aliens. Like that has to be on the table if there are aliens and they've been here for thousands of years, even if they've been here only for 70 years. Like, they are characters in our history then. And we will eventually have to understand what role they have played. And I think that's going to be a very difficult thing for us to wrap our mind around, especially if they are higher dimensional, or they have a greater consciousness capacity, or they have these kinds of telepathic kinds of, like, if we're dealing with beings like that, then I think the degree to which we're going to have to reimagine, re-understand our own history, our own selves is going to be vast, right? This is why I think New Paradigm Institute style work of getting people from as many disciplines as possible to get together and think about this stuff as we push for public disclosure is what we need to be doing.
I've said before, Stephen, have you seen the Marvel movie, The Eternals?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, that idea that there are supreme beings, other higher intelligences, godlike figures throughout history, just nudging humanity at different times, either influencing civilizations to fall or rise. I don't recommend anyone go and watch it. You'd be better shitting in your own hands and clapping for a more enjoyable experience.
But the concept is interesting.
That concept, yeah. There's a couple of minutes worth of concept in that 12-hour film that are worth watching. So,
well, let me say,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say that is what I think. Yeah.
Let me say one thing in this space, and I mean, like, another reason I like working with Danny Sheehan is, right, he talks a lot about paradigm shifts, right? Like, if you haven't read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, you should. It's a classic in the philosophy of science, and one of the things that I think people don't understand about how paradigms work is they're very heavily reinforced, right? And they kind of stay for a while, and then data starts leaking out the sides and not fitting with the paradigm. And then the shift happens all at once. It's not linear, right? It gets to a tipping point, and then everything changes. And this is for people who do this on the individual level, this is the experience called ontological shock, where you kind of go through this radical reimagining of what's possible and what it might be for the history of our planet to be very different than you thought it was. When we go through that process, we have one of the things we're going to have to do is go back and look at every single ancient population to walk this planet. They all said, in all of their literatures, written or oral, they all said that there were beings, non-human beings, who are more powerful than us in various ways, more insightful than us in various ways, that have been interacting with us. Like, that's universal. And I now, on the other side of the paradigm shift, find it very weird and disturbing how willing the contemporary status quo paradigm is to just call every human prior to the emergence of the modern scientific worldview stupid. Like, just, they're obviously morons. They obviously just didn't understand what was going on. And so they thought they were encountering beings from the sky. They thought they were learning things from these other, but they are just anthropomorphizing nature. Like, on the other side of the paradigm shift, I think what we all need to do is go back to our ancient histories and the surviving indigenous histories who have rejected, in many ways, or at least problematized, the modern scientific worldview, and learn from them. Right? I had the great privilege the other day driving through the Navajo reservation on the way to the Grand Canyon to talk to a young woman who works at a Navajo museum, and she's just talking about her personal interactions with these beings that do not fit into the modern Western materialistic scientific worldview, right? She talks about them, how she talks to them, how she hears from them, how a friend of hers was driving and had an encounter with one of them. And like, it now really bothers me how eager and quick our scientific talking heads are to just say, well, obviously all of those people are superstitious morons. Or the world is more complicated than we have modeled it as. And there are things going on that are going to require us to reimagine and re-understand what's going on. And I really strongly predict that at the end of that, the modern scientific worldview and how it has played this dominating feature over all of us, right? Like, it is because we are so sure that the indigenous folk are so dumb that we need to civilize them, right? Like, that has been the story of colonialism since the beginning. These barbaric morons don't understand the world like we do. Let us teach them the ways. And I strongly predict that over the next couple of years, decades, we are going to have to eat a lot of humble pie and go, oh shit, they actually understood the world in a way that we didn't. And our arrogance is going to bite us in the ass. And I really think that the movement for Latin American disclosure that's coming from Latin America is just the first fruits of that. And that very soon, we, the pompous Americans, are going to look like real idiots.
Or some other intelligence appears and says these barbaric morons don't understand this world how we do, so we're going to show them. We end up full Independence Day.
Yeah. Well, we could, like, you and I could talk for a very long time. I have my own thoughts about what the motivations of the neighbors are. And very, very briefly, let me say, there's kind of three big options, that either they're kind of interfering types or they're non-interfering types. And if they're interfering, they're either kind of doing it in ways that are nice or naughty, right? Like either for our benefit or only for theirs to the exclusion of ours. And I think it's pretty clear that we're not dealing with a dominant group of beings that are interfering in either the nice or naughty way. They're not interfering in the nice way because they've allowed a lot of really terrible things to happen, right? Like, essentially the problem of evil in the philosophy of religion just reemerges if there are aliens. Like, why didn't they stop the Holocaust? Why don't they save children when they're kidnapped and abused, right? Like, all those things will still happen. So there doesn't seem to be a group of beings that's in charge and kind of freely able to just stop all the bad things from happening, or they would. It also seems like there's not a group of beings that are just explicitly, like, outright dominating and exploiting us, because there's so many ways we could be obviously exploited that we're not. So I think we can read off the facts of history that if there are aliens around, and they've been around for any significant period of time, then they're mostly driven in their interactions with us by something like the Star Trek style Prime Directive. They value human autonomy for some reason. And they want us to solve our own problems or deal with our own stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I've been spending a lot of time about this and thinking about kind of the ethics and the politics of the Prime Directive and how it relates to things like the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. And I'm more and more inclined to think that if I were a more intelligent, higher consciousness set of beings that was interacting with humans, that I too would be pretty standoffish. Like, we're a kind of disagreeable bunch who keep threatening to nuke each other, and we don't seem to give a shit about the effect that we're torching our environment, and we don't seem to care about the fact that the number one health problem in the United States is obesity, but there are still people dying of malnutrition. We don't seem to care about the fact that, right, et cetera, that some of us are so psychologically traumatized that we feel like the only thing to do is walk into a school full of children and just murder them en masse, right? Like, if I were a group of wise beings who had access to free energy and interstellar travel, would I want humans to have that? No, I wouldn't.
No, not how we are now. And even as a species, we're so desensitized to.
Yeah.
I saw a video on X the other day that went viral of a woman in, I believe it's India, who got hit by a train taking a selfie with it, which I think in itself is a massive, statement and indictment of our
Yeah,
society,
yeah,
where
yeah.
he literally sat on next to a railroad with a group of folks, told her young child to step out the way, tried to pose, and she was so close to the train it hit her in the head,
Oh,
and you could hear it coming, and everyone just,
yeah,
and I thought, but even when I saw that, I wasn't horrified. I'm just like,
yeah,
oh wow, that's terrible. Next
yeah,
video. And that's
yeah,
that's just where we are. And I wonder if something so much more evolved and advanced, it can look at us, that if I was watching a fish farm and some of the fish were attacking other fish, oh, that's bad. Is that
yeah,
the same, just the next level up, where they're watching us
yeah,
and going, some of these are a bit messed up, but we've seen this a
yeah.
thousand times before?
Yeah, that's a really disturbing, but insightful point, right? And I think, like, let's imagine that we're dealing with something like, I know it's all fiction, like science fiction, but like the science fiction has to be a lens on possible reality here,
Mm,
right? Like if there was some kind of galactic federation, right? Like what actually happens in Star Trek is like the galactic federation is hanging out and they're waiting for each species to develop warp drives, right? And then
yeah.
like the second they develop a warp drive, then the Vulcans show up and they're like, hey, we're here too, and let's hang out and we'll introduce you to the neighbors, and right, like that's what happens. So let's say that there is something like that, like an interstellar society that has these policies that are something like the Prime Directive. What would they be thinking of us right now? Well, like just at the time when we started developing modern physics, which would be what would be required to develop a warp drive, right? Like Einstein and friends. What did we do? We built a bomb, and then we committed 2 large-scale acts of terrorism. We killed 2 cities worth of civilians in order to end the Japanese, the war in the Pacific in World War II. You might think that's justified. You might think it's not justified. It's clearly terrorism. We killed innocent people on purpose to impact the political policies of the state of Japan, right? That's what happened. That's what my people did. And then we kind of gave up on it. Like we built bigger bombs. Like we wanted to get we wanted to get fusion so that we could build fusion bombs. But we kind of half-assed our way into nuclear power. We're still burning oil, mostly because the oil companies have a lot of money and they own the politicians. But we could have gone another path. Like we could have had the Einstein insight and then going, like, maybe there's a parallel world where Einstein happened. And then we realized, wow, there's so much energy here. And if we just figure out this, then we can create a post-scarcity economy where we have all of the energy that we need. And
Nikola
then
Tesla.
Yeah, right. And then we build AI, and then we're like, great, now we don't have to do manual labor or any kind of labor that we don't want to do. We can automate labor that we don't want to do, and we can allow that to happen. And then humans can just do whatever they want, right? But no, right now we're so afraid of AI coming, because the way we have our world set up right now. Sorry, there's a phone call.
No, go for it.
The way we have our world set up right now, if you lose your job, you starve to death, right? So there is a fear involved in the coming AI revolution, right? That, oh no, we can't automate away the work that we hate, because then people will starve. No, they won't. Not if we restructure our economy to have a post-scarcity economy where we use things like nuclear fusion, which we're right on the verge of being able to do thanks to AI again, right? Like we're starting to see the capacity to fluctuate the magnetic fields and the plasma, whatever, to be able to make that work better because of AI. We could build robotics because of AI. Like we could automate away all of this labor, and then humans could just do what they want to do for its own sake, and we wouldn't have to be afraid of starving ever again. Why aren't we doing that? It's a politics problem. It's a politics problem. It's not a technological problem. It's a sociological problem, right? Humans right now need to reimagine who we are. I don't even care if you think that I'm totally wrong about all the aliens and the Nazca mummies and whatever. The AI alone is going to change the world in a way that's going to require us to reboot everything. We're going to reimagine what an economy looks like. We're going to have to reimagine what a democracy looks like. We're going to have to rebuild the world from the ground up no matter what. And then if the aliens are here, maybe they can help us as long as we talk to them in the right kinds of ways. And I don't know how to do any of this stuff, but this is the stuff that we have to start thinking about.
Well, talking of thinking about things, Elena asks, what are a couple of things in the UFO non-human intelligence space that you think not enough people are talking about or thinking about, but should be?
Yeah. I think we need to be thinking about that, right? Why? Let's think about it this way. If we think about these beings who have these capacities, right? Like take the standard set of UFO lore seriously, right? These beings have the capacity to disable our nuclear weapons. They can disable our fighter jets. They can disable our warships. They can disable our automobiles, right? Like, so they have the capacity to just solve all of the big problems in the world or dominate us one way or the other, right?
Yeah.
Why aren't they doing that? I just keep asking myself this question over and over and over again, right? And here's my hypothesis. And so think about this, right? Let's say that World War II happens. We'll just focus on the Nazi part of it for a minute. The Nazis start gathering all these groups of people into concentration camps and just doing absolutely unimaginably horrible things to them. Why didn't they stop that from happening? Well, let's imagine if they did. So if they did, and they liberate all the people who were trapped in these horrible, horrible conditions. So you can imagine us. Well, how would we react? Wonderful. Thank you for saving us from this problem. And then what would happen next? Well, then the next crisis would come. And then what we would want to do is get on the phone, right? Hey, can you come stop this? Hey, can you come stop this? Hey, can you come solve this problem? Hey, can you come solve this problem? And if that persisted, right, then there would be this very real problem where humans would just automatically become children, right? We would never grow up. And so what I want everybody thinking about is, what does it look like for the human species, the human family, to grow up enough to be able to interact with these beings, if they're actually real, to be able to interact with them as peers, or at least as like young adults in the cosmic community. And I think if you start asking those questions, there are some really obvious and glaring answers about why we're not grown up enough yet. Then we got to solve those, and we got to do that anyways. So like I like to think about the kind of cost benefit analysis stuff, right? Like, is it really safe to think about all these crazy things? Yeah, it is, because all it's actually going to lead us to, what can we do about this? Like, sure, we can push for government transparency. That's a great idea. But we can also start thinking about, what does a world look like with free energy? What does a world look like with interstellar travel? What does a world look like where we can interact with beings who are more knowledgeable, higher consciousness, whatever, than us? Like, thinking about those, this is why philosophy is great, right? Like, we can think about the implications of things even if we don't think they're real, right? So minimally, think like a good philosopher, do a thought experiment. If there are beings out there and they're not interacting with us, why aren't they interacting with us? I bet it's because we're not ready yet. And if we ask, why aren't we ready yet? We already know the answers, and we already know what we're supposed to do, and we're already not doing it. So let's just do those things. And then if Steve's wrong and there's no aliens and the Nazca mummies are all fakes, oh no, we created a world in which we're more just and more kind and more open-minded and more respectful of people with different views. And that's better anyways.
Yeah, I agree. It's a largely observational thing that's going on. And I'm, again, if you just pick an extreme example of like North and South Korea, while you've got this big bit of land where there's a special line that's imaginary that you're not allowed to walk across in either direction, that's littered with landmines and barbed wire, and they make a big deal of it when two people shake hands over it, then no, they're not landing tomorrow. And that's before you even go into anything else going on right now across the planet. Like, I can 100% see why we're nowhere near. And like you say, again, people who are like, oh, well, nuclear war would be averted, they would come down, and well, they didn't in the past. And nuclear explosions happen all the time, tests and whatnot in different places. So there's no relying on that. So yeah, 100%. Listen, loads more questions to try and fire through just to finish up.
Sure.
Ross asks, has Dr. Steven had much luck in getting some traction from respectable academic authorities in regard to the mummies? Is pessimistic skepticism still the default position to adopt in academia?
I do think, well, it depends on what you mean by pessimistic skepticism. I would say materialistic skepticism is still the norm in academia, right? The idea that there might be these kind of higher consciousness beings around, like, that's not going to be taken very seriously. Telepathy is not going to be taken very seriously. Fringe views about even things like aliens are not going to be taken very seriously. I'm not sure that's the same as pessimism, so I want to be careful about that. Am I finding people, really smart people, who are taking this seriously? Yeah. It happened for me in a couple of ways, both through the kind of Nazca stuff. I released this video on a bunch of really smart people, academic people. Not all smart people are academic people. A bunch of smart people and a bunch of academic people, in which there is some overlap, right? Have reached out to me, and so I've gotten to know a lot of really wonderful people who are thinking about these things very carefully and very open-mindedly. And on the kind of New Paradigm Institute of things, yes, I'm the academic team lead for the Citizens for Disclosure thing that they're doing. So they basically handed me like a Google spreadsheet full of names of people who signed up to be involved in Citizens for Disclosure, which is trying to, push for things like the AAP Disclosure Act.
Yeah.
And a bunch of people said they were academics. And so, I have all those people's contact information. So I've been gathering them and getting them to talk to each other. And one thing that has been really wonderful about that is, and there's maybe like about 20 of us that are talking to each other now. All of us feel this deep sense of relief to meet other people who have that kind of level of academic rigor, to know how to do research, know how to think about these big picture kinds of questions carefully. And being able to talk to other people with that academic mindset who are also taking UFOs, Nazca mummies, et cetera, higher consciousness kinds of things seriously. It's been really wonderful. So yeah, there is a growing movement of people, intellectual people, who are taking it seriously. But there is I still think the dominant attitude is dismissive.
Matt asks a few questions. I've picked one of them. Matt said, thank you for helping in the topic and having the guts to do so publicly. Enough brown-nosing, Matt. He asks, do you know if anyone has discussed a hypothesis of the role of the implants, like if they have a function other than something just cultural?
There has been discussion about them, but there's very little to go off of here. They don't seem to have any obvious structure to them. If there is a complicated structure, it's got to be at like a nanotech level, right? It looks like a metal plate. It's not like it has gears or wires or anything in it. So might it have a really like atom by atom built technology in there? Maybe. I don't know how we would know that. Apparently there is some evidence that the metal plates, this was spoken about in the second Mexico hearing, the one that happened in November. I think it was actually on my birthday, which is November 7th. There was I forget who it was, but one of the presenters talked about how it does seem like the flesh around the metal has grown around it, has interacted with it, which would imply that it's not just like glued on, but that it had been there when the being was alive. But as far as, and if you look at one of the things that my modest team of people is working on is just trying to get as comprehensive an inventory as possible of how many of these things there are and what their different types are. One of the things that you discover when you go through this is that there's a wide variation in how many implants and where they are. You know what? There was a question earlier about, is there any sign of like wear, like living wear in the, and the answer does seem to be yes. So, one of the people that I'm working more closely with is an X-ray tech, and he's been talking about ways in which it does look like there is some wear and tear. Like one of the bodies, I think it's, I forget, Alberto, has an implant in the hip. And there seems to be some indication that there was odd wear and tear in the hip, like maybe something was wrong with Alberto's hip. So there, I don't know. The answer is really no. The implants are in various different places. Of the larger beings, the ones that are more like full-size humans with elongated skulls and the tridactyl hands and feet. There's one that has a plate on the back that looks like it might have characters on it. If you look this up on Reddit, there's an interesting thread that suggests that those characters might be ancient Chinese characters, which would be a very strange thing for there to be in Peru. Yeah, the deeper you dig into how many strange things are going on in Peru, there's a lot of strange things going on in Peru. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. And final question from Kate. Kate asks, and I think this is a nice final question. Do you believe there is an overall message the phenomenon is trying to tell us? And if so, what might that be?
I don't know. I really don't. I suspect. So I teach a lot of really fun classes at Ohio State. I teach a class called Death and the Meaning of Life. I teach Asian philosophies class. I teach philosophy of religion, philosophy of art. I teach a class called Global Flourishing. One of the things I like to say in general is that the big questions have obvious answers that we've known for thousands of years, right? What's the meaning of life? It is to do valuable things. There's a lot of valuable things that we can do. It involves treating other beings with compassion and kindness and respect and being creative and patient and not getting too caught up in things that don't matter very much. Like do the right thing for the right reason and don't get too caught up in getting the outcomes that you want, right? The big questions have kind of obvious and boring answers that we've known for a long time. And I suspect that at the end of the day, that will be what we learn here too. There's the problems to solve are obvious. We know what they are. There's not actually that much surprise here, right? Like, why are we still cruel? Why are we still allowing people to die who don't need to die? Why are we still allowing the powerful to dominate the powerless? Why are we still not listening to people who are different from us? Why are we still not kind? Why are we still impatient? Why are we still so caught up in simple selfish kind of pleasures and power struggles? And I suspect it's boring in the sense that it's just stuff we already know.
No, very fair. Listen, thank you very much. Everyone who sent in a question, thank you. If you didn't hear your question, it was answered in the body of the interview or in Stephen discussing someone else's question. We've gone off the rails a few times. And Stephen, to you, you've been wonderful with your time. We've been well over 2 hours now.
We have, yeah.
Yeah, and it could have been longer. Listen, there was a few times I wanted to go off on tangents, but we'll save that for another show.
Sure, have me back sometime. That'll be fun.
Absolutely, we'll get folks to chime in. But what do you foresee, just to finish up, your role being in this subject, going forward? And again, I'm going to be honest, you talk like someone who has a long storied interest in the subject and not just someone who's come into it in the last 18 months.
Thank you. I am focusing on two things. The New Paradigm Institute stuff, which is essentially trying to get academics who are taking these questions seriously to talk to each other and put together the best plan we can for what a post-disclosure world might look like and how we get there and what might go wrong and how we might avoid some of those problems. And so, if you're someone who works in academia and you want to be a part of that effort, my email address is steve@newparadigminstitute.org. So you can email me there and we can chat about stuff. That's one of the things I'm trying to do. And then I'm pretty closely involved with the Nazca stuff at this point. Just trying to keep an eye on what's happening and trying to think about ways I can help and, trying to get people with relevant scientific expertise, anthropological expertise, et cetera, to take it seriously. I take it that my role there is just kind of being a big picture thinker and trying to keep people from getting distracted by the small things and being like, yeah, it looks like a llama skull, but what about this other stuff? like that's kind of the role that I'm trying to play. So yeah, for me, that I have these two anchors that are holding me right now. I think David Grusch is telling the truth, and I think the Nazca mummies are worth more attention. And so I'm kind of trying to invest in the U.S. policy side of things through the New Paradigm Institute and the Nazca stuff through my network of relationships with the people working on the Nazca stuff.
That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify, just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue.